Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Solar Embrace Chapter 8, Carnal Arts and Crafts. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon by the time Celestia and Spike reached a scheduled spot under the main waterfall, far away from where they had cleaned themselves. It was not the alcove Celestia had told Spike about before, which was still a good distance yet from their current location, but it would do the trick for sheltering them for the night. They were nearly to the rocky portion of the volcano's base, where they would eventually ascend to Celestia's mentioned spot, but for the moment they were tired and rather hungry. A distant rumble, however, put their plans on moving out first thing in the morning on hold. Even as they were sheltered, they could see the tops of trees move in the distance, buffeted by increasing winds blowing in off the ocean. "How many times is it going to rain on this stinking island?" Spike asked in a somewhat grumpy manner, despite what he was transpired mere hours before. This'll be the third time in about as many days. "I know, Spike, I know, but it cannot be helped," Celestia said as they set up where they would sleep. "I cannot command weather on this island as the Pegasi do in Ponyville. And our time here happened to coincide with a wet season in this part of the world. Be thankful we are not in the path of any truly large storm, like a cyclone, or else we'd truly be in trouble." Of all the things she had been taught by her parents when she was younger, perhaps one of the only things Celestia had not paid attention to was the magic needed to bend the weather to one's will. Her parents, stern yet understanding alicorns, had actually complimented her for this, as they saw it as her insight into the true natural process she would someday have to experience. If she could control the weather in its entirety, ponies would become too reliant on her, and go from virtually worshipping her to actually worshipping her, complete with religious ceremonies, prayers for rain, and in most extreme cases holy wars against those who preyed on to others. Neither Celestia, Luna, nor their parents wanted anything like that to happen, so weather magic had been swept under the rug to make way for spells on levitation and telepathy. Spike drank from a small pool of clean water, the contents filtered by the rocks high above. It was crisp and carried with it the delicious natural flavoring of the stones through which it filtered, a taste very subtle to others, but strikingly blatant to one such as dragons. Well, thank goodness for small miracles. What would the dry season be like anyway? He asked, traipsing back and forth where Celestia had their food laid out. "Closer to weather in the Everfree Forest, I should think," Princess Celestia said, popping a few ripe berries into her mouth. "Rain every other week or so, though in far less quantities during the later parts of and lasting not nearly as long." "Sounds pretty nice," the dragon said, munching on some sugarcane stalk. He looked out in the sheltered little alcove, the green of the island giving way to the endless blue ocean. Even with the surety of approaching storm, Spike felt calm and rather at peace. Well, except for one thing that kept going in his mind. Two things, actually. He had lost control when washing Celestia. Granted, she had seemed rather happy when he did, and he could remember everything he had done, but the sensation of not actually being the one to do those things to her made him feel upset, jealous even. He wanted to be the one to be with Celestia, and he wanted to be the one that would ultimately be given her virginity. He didn't want some innate other side of his brain to just take over and steal away something he had been chosen to receive. That brought him to his second train of thought. Celestia had given him a hand job in the waterfall. Granted, it had arisen out of her clearing him, and had been rather unavoidable, given what they were destined to do on this island, but a hand job still was. Not counting his rather miserable performance, the tales of which would hopefully never be told to any pony ever. He just felt unclean. Why would Celestia have to initiate the first vaguely sexual encounter they had? Why couldn't he be the one to set up and make her feel good, and experience some form of great bodily pleasure? Was he a coward for having thoughts like these? Certainly, though much of his younger life, Spike had been prone to bouts of insecurity, self-doubt, and at times outright fear. like the last time he had immaturely assumed zombies had taken over Ponyville, when in fact they had all been hiding from Zakora, pure, simplistic, rather immature, and misplaced fear. Or that time he was so worried Twilight was going to replace him with Owlicious that he ran away from home after idiotically trying to frame the owl for some stupid crime. Once again, fear and uncertainty had sure made their presence known in his life. Out here in the island, though, things were rather different. Since those incidents so many years ago, Spike had grown up, pure and simple. He refused to be afraid of the same kinds of things he had once found terrifying. He no longer saw the terrors of maybes and what-ifs. However, while he may have grown out of his frightening shell of a former life, he had not completely outgrown two equally important aspects that had defined him so long: his self-doubt and subsequent indecisiveness. Here, on this island, he was tasked with having sex with Celestia in order to save the world. Granted, having sex with her would be the easiest part of the whole thing. The hardest thing would not only be overcoming his self-doubts, not only overcoming his indecisive nature, but to do something he never thought he'd be capable of. He'd have to show Celestia he thought of her not as his princess, nor as a future lover, but as a mare and a fellow thinking, feeling, breathing being. Spike would have to administer to her needs, though not out of honor-bound code of conduct that meant he had to make things as good for her as she was going to for him. No, he'd have to do this not as an obligation, but as a gift. The dragon knew Celestia, though her various ways of telling him was as much a virgin as he, and for the life of him it was a humbling thought. He didn't feel obligated to try and make her first time something special and tender. He wanted to do that. Truly, with every fiber of his being, he wanted to make her happy in ways she never had been before. In fact, he wasn't exactly sure he even deserved such a gift, but Celestia had made up her mind, and refusal would be the worst possible thing he could do, for both of them and for the world. He just hoped he was up to the admittedly many tasks set before him. First things first, he had to repay Celestia for her earlier ministrations. He had been thinking long and hard on exactly how to do just that, and perhaps one-upping the princess would be the best way to kick things off. Still, he couldn't just jump her. Where was the fun and/or sense in that? It'd have to be nice, slow, and a gradual acceleration of their soon-to-be intimate relationship. "Spike, is something the matter?" Celestia asked, completely unaware of how detailed and thorough Spike's thought processes were becoming. If she could have sensed them, she might not have even known it was him. Spike had not thought like this before in his life, but this island was changing him. Celestia herself was changing him. All of his life experiences, both past and present, were coming together in an ultimately glorious combination. "What? Oh, I was just thinking," Spike said softly, as he finished a small handful of berries. Somewhere beyond the sea, somewhere waiting for him, were his friends. They had no idea what he had to do, and thankfully none of them would find out from him. Now, to set his suddenly laid plan into motion. "About what?" Celestia asked, somewhat curious as she bit into a small, juicy mango. The thunder rumbling in the distance was oddly offset by the constant low rumble of the waterfalls not too far away. In fact, she could feel the constant pounding of water against the mighty stone, even from this far away. It reminded her of a low thrum of the ocean's waves against the island's sandy shores, back when they had first arrived on the island. "Just things, life in general, I guess," Spike said, his voice lower than before. It almost sounded like back at the waterfall. In fact, it sounded exactly like it had been back at the waterfall. And the slight baritone edge that it exuded brought a slight tremor to Celestia's spine. Spike's eyes, however, were the same as they had always been when he turned to face her, so maybe she was just imagining that side of him again. I've been meaning to ask you something." "Yes," Celestia said, wondering why she sounded so breathless when Spike slowly crawled to her side. Sure, they were naked, and previously the mere thought of being seen naked by one of her subjects proved to horrify her to no end. But out here, she didn't mind it so much. "No, scratch that," She somewhat enjoyed being naked. It was like being free of all the worries and stresses of what life brought upon you. All of that being dependent on what type of clothing you were to wear. "Can I do something to you?" the dragon asked as he sidled up next to her, the warmth of his body, a pleasant and reassuring feeling. It was like the blanket she had when she was just a little filly, something she had been reluctant to give up until her arrival on Earth, meant she could not bring it with her. Hopefully her parents hadn't gotten rid of it. Maybe she'd visit them sometime in the near future, and see if they still had it. Maybe she could bring Spike along to introduce him to her family. What do you want to do?" the princess asked, wondering why she felt too warm. All of a sudden, Spike's presence, something before that brought comfort and security, was beginning to feel intoxicating, and in an entirely good way, too. "That depends," he said, his eyes looking into hers with a gentle expression of compassion. "Do you trust me?" Of course I do, Spike," was all Celestia could manage to sputter out. Seriously, why was she becoming so flustered when he was with this close to her? She had just given him a hand job less than a few hours ago, and now she was the one acting like it had been the most upsetting event to ever transpire on the island. I do trust you, I really do." "Then I'm going to ask you to close your eyes," the dragon said, his voice almost a purr as he moved another inch closer. "Why, may I ask, do I need to close my eyes?" Celestia asked, her breath catching in her throat at his tone. "I'm just going to try something," was all that the dragon said. Now, in any other kind of situation, Celestia would have undoubtedly asked Spike just what he was doing, and likely would have kept asking until he relented and spilled the collective beans on the matter. But out here, far from the titles and powers that declared her to be a princess and him to just one another of her subjects, she felt such a protocol was unneeded. She, after leaning against a soft mat of wall-clinging moss, she closed her eyes and waited. She could feel the dragon beside her shuffle slightly, as if he were reaching for something. The feeling of something wet and cold pressing against her lip made the princess open her eyes in fright. Looking down, she saw ripe strawberries, some of the many she had picked while Spike had lay back in the cave. She glanced over at Spike, who seemed to have a disappointed look on his face. "Celestia, please close your eyes and leave them closed until I ask you to open them," he said, as he pulled the strawberry away from her lips. The pile of food was closer to them than the princess had remembered. Perhaps that was why she felt him shuffle around a bit. He was bringing it all with easy reach. "Okay, Spike, I'll keep them closed, I promise," the princess said, closing her eyes once more. "Now, I'm going to ask you to open your mouth, slowly," Spike said softly as Celestia felt the strawberries press against her lips once more. This time she did as she was asked, and slowly opened her mouth, feeling the strawberry gently enter. "Now chew," the dragon whispered, his hot breath feeling very welcomed along her long, slender throat. Celestia did as Spike said and slowly chewed the strawberry, feeling the juices of the fruit immediately fill her mouth. It had been a perfect berry, ripe yet firm and almost sinfully sweet. Licking her lips after swallowing its emulsified remains, she felt something press against her lips once more. Taking whatever it was Spike was giving into her mouth once more, she chewed gently, only to be surprised by the sudden contrast of flavor. It's somewhat sour," she said to Spike. It did not taste bad, but it wasn't a fruit. It was a leaf, and yet it was strangely familiar to her taste buds. "Well, I should think so," Spike said. "Those are the last few leaves of the thorn wall. I found them in some of the folds of the bag." "Oh, well, that would explain the aftertaste," Celestia said, swallowing the mashed-up remains of leaf. "May I have more?" "Here," the dragon said softly, pressing something else to her mouth. It felt too large to be a small fruit or a leaf, so Celestia tentatively took a bite out of it. Immediately warm, sticky juices flowed over her mouth and over her face, dripping off her chin. A mango," the princess guessed, as she let the sweet flesh of the fruit roll around in her mouth. It was ripe, perhaps a few days too ripe, as normally there wouldn't have been this much juice rolling down her chin. She could feel the tiny rivulets of it running down her into her throat and into the valley between her breasts, while the drips from her chin landed on her stomach. "Yes," Spike replied, as he helped her take another bite, which sent even more sticky sweet juices down her face. For a few minutes they just sat there, watching the bright eyes of the princess happily munched on the juicy fruit. Her coat, so pristine after the shower under the waterfall, was becoming sticky and matted with excess juices, and the pure white it had been was becoming marred by the orangish fluid that dripped off her chin and ran down her throat. Spike found it strangely erotic, and it was giving him ideas. Celestia had opened her mouth for the next thing from Spike, and she felt a barely brush against her lips, but for some reason it did not go into her mouth. Wondering why this was, the princess was tempted to open her eyes, but then she felt it press against her lips once more, trying to bite into whatever Spike was offering. She grew frustrated when it drew it just out of her reach. "Guess what it is," Spike whispered after she made a slight moaning noise. She wanted to taste the food, to feel any juices it exuded running down her throat. "Guess what it is, and it will be yours, Celestia." "Is it another strawberry?" she asked, wondering why she felt breathless, even though she had been breathing regularly the entire time. She could feel the stickiness of the mango juices against her skin, soaking through her pelt, and for some reason she didn't care. She wanted it there. She wanted Spike to clean it up, preferably with his lips, or even his tongue. Why her mind went along that train of thought, she did not know. "No, guess again," the dragon said, letting whatever he was holding brush past Celestia's lips, enough for her to take a small noise of frustration at the incorrect guess. "It's a piece of sugar cane?" she asked, sounding a bit more determined. "Guess again, Celestia," the dragon said, his tone hinting at the small smirk that had graced his lips. He really was having fun with this whole idea. He'd have to thank Pinkie Pie when he got back for inventing a food-based guessing game like this. Only back in Ponyville it had never gotten anywhere near this sensual. Is it a cherry?" Celestia felt like she had to peek, just to know what it was, but something inside her forbade her eyelids from opening. She trusted Spike, and so she wanted him to trust her. Her eyes remained closed as her brain went through everything she had managed to scrounge up from them. "Bingo!" Spike said with a small chuckle as he gently let the cherry slide into Celestia's waiting mouth, the pit already removed with a single incision from one of his own retracted claws. This princess muttered, gladly chewing the cherry with gusto. She had always liked cherries, the color, the sweetness, the instant craving that left you wanting more. The minute she was finished, she felt another piece of food press against her lips, which she opened once again to try an envelope. As before, Spike pulled it just out of her reach, his hot breath washing down her sticky neck. "Spike, I'm getting a bit full," the princess said, having eaten a bit of food before starting this little game of the dragons. "Okay, but 2 more things, okay?" Spike asked softly. If her eyelids had been indeed open, she'd have seen the dragon giving her the infamous puppy dog look that had been perfected as a youngster. "I guess 2 more wouldn't hurt," Celestia said, feeling the food Spike was holding brush past her lips once more. "Is this another mango?" "Excellent guess," the dragon said, as he held the ripe fruit for the alicorn to gently munch on. "It's a bit smaller, though." "That is fine," the princess said, as she bit deeply into the fruit, feeling more of the juices run down her face and onto her upper body once more. A few drops even found their way to her aureoles and nipples. Finishing that piece, the princess waited for Spike to place the last fruit against her lips, but something else did. Something warm and very, very soft. It pulled away in an instant, leaving her terribly confused and incredibly curious. "You can open your eyes this time," Spike mumbled, his own eyes closing as he felt her soft lips once more make contact with him. Opening her eyes, Celestia saw Spike was kissing her. Befuddled for the merest of moments, she pulled his head closer with one free hand and deepened the kiss, her own lips threatening to crack into a smile as she did so. "So you clever little dragon, you," she thought to herself as their mouths parted and their tongues slowly slid over one another. "You thought all of this as a way to get me to kiss you. Bravo, Spike, bravo." Spike could not help but feel incredibly aroused by the taste of Celestia's saliva. It carried with it all the fruits and other things she had eaten, the cherries, the mangoes, the strawberries, and even those slightly sour leaves from the thorn bush. He could taste it all, as well as the naturally sweet breath she exuded. Flicking his tongue over her lips, like a snake after pulling apart from the kiss, Spike looked deep into her eyes and smirked slightly. "Oh, Celestia, you've gone and gotten yourself rather messy. What do you have to say for yourself?" Celestia positively purred at the tone of his voice. He sounded both mock serious and sexier than, well, anything she'd ever heard. "Oh my," spiked the dragon, "I do seem to have besmirched my pelt with all these juices," she cooed, her eyes twinkling in delight as she saw the dragon blink in surprise and arousal. "Do you think you could help me clean up?" Celestia had no true experience with talking dirty, but the way Spike was eyeing her up after the particular statement, she must have had a knack for it. "It would be my pleasure, Your Highness," Spike said, placing a not-so-chaste kiss on the princess's cheek, letting his tongue slide out, and slowly began to work on the sweet sticky juices covering his princess's face. In equine society, social grooming had not truly changed from what it had been when all ponies were still in nomadic tribes many thousands of years before. Ponies would groom each other's manes, hugs would be given, kisses exchanged, and perhaps most different from other beings' cultures, equines shared in a social bonding with mates and offsprings with licking. Now, alicorns had similarly developed a strong social interaction along these lines, even though they had been far removed from the same kinds of forces that had shaped other pony societies over the millennia. To them, grooming with a tongue was not only a sign of deep friendship and trust, but a sure sign of eroticism within a relationship. So, understandably, Celestia's spine felt chill after chill go up in it as Spike carefully caressed her face with his tongue. Soon enough her face was more or less clean, and she saw, and obviously felt, Spike move down past her chin and onto her neck. Here, however, he did not just let his tickling tongue flicker out to clean her off. All along her throat he laid patterns of butterfly kisses. There were the merest touch of setting skin on fire with a strange and wondrous emotion. She couldn't help but giggle when his tongue caressed the areas where her Adam's apple would be, if she were born a colt and not a filly. Spike could feel every breath she took as he kissed and nuzzled her neck, the juice-soiled coat becoming more and more pristine with every licking kiss. He could feel her pulse with his lips altogether faster than he had thought, but no greater than his own at that point. All of this stimulation was doing wonders for both of their heart rates. Both Spike forced blood away from a certain aspect of his anatomy as best he could. He didn't want to give her any ideas just yet. That would come later, no doubt. Eventually, Spike's lips moved down past her creamy white throat and onto the princess's collarbone, where the kisses had a rather different effect. Here they were not just soft, but soothing as well, like a massage after a hard day's work. Granted, growing up, Celestia had always had problems putting up with her filled-in figure, something her sister Luna had experienced at around the same age. They both were built with large luggage on both of their chests and rear ends, but for the most part it was all balanced out. Still, as the dragon's lips gently nipped at her collarbone, Celestia felt a tingle travel all the way to the tip of her horn to the bottom of her hooves. "Spike," she whispered, hoping he wouldn't answer her at all and just keep continuing what he was doing. Can you go lower?" Him not touching the still soiled regions of her upper body was causing to develop a peculiar itch. She did not actually itch, per se, but she needed contact there to relieve herself, and right then and there she wanted Spike to be the one to do that. "With pleasure," the dragon whispered, his lips hovering above the princess's soft pelt, though he was not actually touching her then and there. His voice sent a very thrilling vibration through her entire solar plexus, something Celestia found to be very intriguing. Soon enough, and none too soon, for the alicorn Spike's lips moved further downward, as did his tongue, eventually stopping. "Oh," Celestia gasped, arching her chest forward slightly as Spike's long, sinuous tongue caressed her upper curves and inner valley of her breasts. Her breathing hitched in her throat. It took all of Celestia's willpower to not just place her hands on Spike's head and shove his face into her heaving bosom. Instead, she just lowered her chin and looked down at the dragon, finding it very hard to not focus on every single movement of his swirling tongue. It was long, like that of a snake of lizard, to be sure, but the width of it, combined with the very non-reptilian texture, belied the true nature of a dragon. They were not some common form of reptilian. They belonged to a race far older than any species on Earth had a right to claim. Back when the world was in its primordial infancy, they lived and died far away from the confines of this planet's atmosphere, serving under an even mightier race that had inhabited the stars for eons before even them. Before the ancient and mighty race there had been nothing. Celestia's thoughts on the deep past were thrown off a bridge and stampeded by a herd of angry buffalo when the dragon's tongue swirled around one of her breast's areolas, and in every shrinking circle finally flipped the very tip of her rock-hard nipple. Celestia let forth a soft, keening cry, unable to hold back as her body spasmed softly. Her nerves were alive with electricity, and her skin felt as though the dragon were bathing her in liquid fire. She loved it. She loved the way he was making her feel, all with just his tongue in his lips. The instant he switched over to another nipple, she let forth another keening cry, her voice carrying beyond her secluded alcove. Spike looked up in surprise and slightly worry. "Is something wrong, Celestia?" he asked. Her glare of anger at him having stopped would have sent any of her royal guards, or enemies for that matter, running for the hills. "Don't stop," she said, her voice more of a command than any sort of suggestion. She couldn't help herself. The way she was making her feel was indescribable. If he stopped then and there, she'd likely sock him right in the gut, and then curse him to see polka dots for a few days. Spike went back to his ministrations, this dominating/angry side of Celestia being a rather erotic sight. Who knew passion and eroticism could go hand in hand with anger and turn into an unbelievably sexy? Celestia's keening cries returned for a short while, only to be replaced by loud, pleasure-filled whinnies, as Spike's lips wrapped around one of her nipples and sucked hard. One of her legs shot out, colliding with the rock sticking out of the ground. It held, and her leg was now propped open to one side, but Celestia was far more focused on Spike's nibbling of her nipples than on her surroundings. By the sun and the moon and his tongue, it flicked across the tip of her nipple as the rest was engulfed by his tender lips. Celestia's wings came up alongside her in a flash, stiffer than pine board and unlikely to get soft any time soon. She felt her eyes roll into the back of her skull when his teeth slightly teased the nipple as well. The sheer pleasure of feeling making her go all numb in her nether regions. Then he switched over to the other nipple, pressing his face full against it, and her yelps doubled in volume. By the stars, if any pony else were anywhere near them, they'd have thought she was crying. Crying she was, though not out of sadness or despair, but out of joy and pleasure. The feeling of the dragon's nuzzling, licking, suckling on her nipples drove the princess wild. If her hair had been attached to her as her wings, it would have been standing on end, straight as an arrow. Her other leg fell open to the side, weak from trying to keep itself propped up. Then, pressing her breasts together, the dragon somehow managed to suck them on both of them at once, and still flick his forked tongue over the tips of both. The alicorn princess felt as though her eyes would shoot out of her skull. There was a pressure building within her entire body, and if it wasn't released somehow in some way, she'd likely explode from it all. Celestia made a great noise of disappointment when Spike removed his lips from her nipples. looking down at him with puppy dog eyes. "Why did you stop?" she asked, almost sounding as though she was about to cry. "I'm not done," Spike said simply, his hot breath washing over her stomach as he continued his way down. The butterfly kisses on her toned abdominal muscles and the soft licks from his tongue between the muscle edges sent unique chills up and down her stomach and rear, and things even lower than that. "Oh my," Celestia gasped, her next set of words never leaving her lips as she saw Spike descend below her trim waistline. She felt his lips graze her pelt just above her most private parts. "Spike, what are you—" Her voice caught in her throat as the dragon placed a kiss directly on her puffy, leaking lower lips. Instead of comprehensible words, Celestia let forth a cry that could have been mistaken for a dying animal, like a cat or some sort of seal. It was loud, it was long, and the entire time she made that noise, Celestia trembled and shook like a tree in a hurricane. Every kiss was like a punch to her gut, sending all coherent thoughts flying out of her ears like bats from a cave. Then something rose up along Spike's lips, and Celestia was able to look down in time to see two Spike's fingers rub against the outer edges of her marehood. The circles they were making becoming smaller and smaller. Then, in one swift and yet strangely slow motion, he sent two fingers into her. Celestia's horn shot off a beam of magic so strong it shot through the cloud high above them and caused it to rip apart in a completely uncloud-like fashion, briefly illuminating the area. The cloud behind that, traumatized by the experience, began releasing all of its fluids in fear, and so began the storm. Rain came down in sheets across the entire island as lightning flashed across the sky and thunder sounded in the deep. Neither of them seemed to notice. Spike was far too focused on the task at hand, and Celestia, well, her mind wasn't exactly in the right place at that moment. She was being babbled incessantly between every shriek and whinny, her fingers curling so tightly into fists she was leaving marks in her palms. Her tongue lolled out of her mouth as her eyelids fluttered like she had something in her eyes. Then Spike twisted his fingers, and Celestia's one hoof, still held in place by the stone it had been on for the past few minutes, pushed right through the hard rock while it was made of tissue paper. Little shards of rock flew everywhere, bouncing off Spike's back and skidding around them like little bits of hail. Spike, leaving his sinuously twisting fingers firmly enshrouded by Celestia's absolutely gorgeous and gushing lower lips, trailed a few kisses up her now clean body and ended up right next to the princess's face. Her large breasts jiggled fiercely with every labored breath, their small circular movements threatening to hypnotize the dragon if he did not concentrate. If not for the fact that Celestia was crying out in pleasure, Spike would have thought the tears on her face were those of pain. But the dumb side of her on her face belied their true cause. She was in heaven right now, in there. She was feeling this good, experiencing this utmost pleasure, all due to him, inexperienced he was. Truth be told, he loved every second of it. He was the one doing this to her. He was the one bringing her such feelings and emotions. Her body shook with every ragged breath. Her incessant rambling sounded like music to his ears. "Celestia," he whispered, looking into her wide, just lust-addled eyes. Her mane flared all around her as if it had a mind of its own, looking haggard and unkempt, and yet somehow incredibly sexy. Celestia looked back at him, her eyes somehow locking onto his even as her mouth refused to respond to the saying her name. "Come," Spike simply whispered. He had been thinking of this moment almost since he had begun this little game, and now perhaps she, too, would feel the same euphoric release he had felt back at the waterfall. Celestia whinnied louder than she had ever before at those words, and in an instant the entire world shattered for her. Every thought, every idea, all perceptions of reality disappeared as she felt her entire body clench at the same time. It was as though she was being compressed into a small tube, getting smaller and smaller as the milliseconds stretched into days. It was torturous, it was unbelievable, it was incredible. She loved every waking moment of it, her cries ceasing as her body floundered on the soft moss. Celestia's marehood expelled her sexual juices, coating the insides of her legs and splashing all over Spike's hands and even his forearm. Like a dam bursting in the midst of some ancient flood, it continued for who knew how long, her lungs struggling to remain brain-fueling oxygen. Spike, in an almost cruel manner, lifted his fingers to his lips, right in front of Celestia's wide, exhausted eyes, and in an almost obscene manner he licked them, and the entirety of his forearm clean, his lustful smirk sending the unbidden chill down Celestia's wings. To him her juices were sweeter than the richest of honeys, with a very powerful underlying flavor that reminded him of cinnamon. Placing a kiss on her tear-soaked cheeks, Spike gently lay beside her, watching as she struggled to regain her composure. Spike, the princess tried to say, unable to even form the words she wanted to say. She didn't even know truly what had just happened. Was this an orgasm or something far stronger? Was this magic on a whole new other level? Good night, Your Highness, Spike said, closing his eyes and cuddling next to the alicorn. In his mind, he couldn't have been more thrilled with what had transpired. He had instinctively known he'd managed to work up the princess enough to where he could do that to her, something he had found to be surprisingly arousing, even though nothing was being done for him in the act. Just the thought of seeing her in that state, and knowing it had been him who had brought her to that peak, was more than enough for him. However, he had not expected to learn so much about Celestia in a state as he had thought he would. Celestia would be a screamer, something he had not thought would transpire. Here he had thought she'd be this quiet, demure lover, and yet she would instead be something of a sexual banshee, a thought he found most erotic. The instant he learned of that, he had been entirely thankful they were alone on this secluded island, lest some pony or something overhear them and come to investigate. The reason she was a screamer, though, was perhaps a bit unsettling. The alicorn's princess's body was highly sensitive to his touch, even more so more aroused she became. That could be a problem if they were to consummate sooner rather than later. Spike had no idea how he was going to fit himself into something that appeared so small. Perhaps they would need to discuss that at some point in the near future. The storm raged around them, with lightning flashing, thunder rumbling, and rain pelting every which way. But they were secure in their little alcove, so Celestia managed to turn her wary mind towards more pressing matters. Spike had brought her to what had definitely been an orgasm, something she had never experienced before. That being said, she now knew why. There had always been a slightly hollow feeling in the pit of her stomach every time Spike had aroused her on their way to this island, but they had never done anything to complete it. He had been building her up, only to leave her hanging, and the poor dragon hadn't even known it at that time. Still, for the dragon, who had only just received a hand job a few short hours before, he was remarkably adept at bringing her to that peak in a slow and torturous process that had driven her absolutely wild. As Celestia finally gave in to her wary body's demands, she could only think of one thing she would have to do. I'm going to get him back for that, she thought, her smile exhausted but genuine, and filled with knowledge of what was still to come in the following weeks. Slipping off into her well-deserved slumber, the princess instinctively pulled the sleeping dragon closer to her, secure and happy in his embrace. Author's note: in the words of George Tacky, oh my, I was mostly inspired for this by the food scene in the movie 9.5 Weeks. Kim Basinger, she's just so beautiful. Stay tuned until the next time. Things will definitely begin to heat up, wink wink. On another note, many of you have noticed my cover art was taken down due to one of the new rules. If any of you would be so kind as to help me look for a substitute replacement, PM the result should you find one. They will then be administrated on a poll, through which you, the fans, can choose the next cover piece. Many thanks. Hope you guys have enjoyed. Have a wonderful day, and one thing before I leave. Guys, it's been a thing on my channel forever, and I should probably reinstate it, is that I do not take requests if they are in comment form. Please personal message me on YouTube, providing whatever you want as long as it has a direct link to the fanfiction. I will not take requests in comments of videos otherwise. Thank you, and have a wonderful day.